Hello, hello. So happy to have you here. Welcome to our first episode of the podcast, which is a nice step in a good direction for us. And I'm so excited to share this and to watch the growth and connect with people in the world and in our community here on the lower mainland of British Columbia, or the stolen unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. I'm going to share a little bit about us here at Tulā so that you can get familiar with what we're doing and why we're doing it and all of that. So Tulā is a multifaceted so-called business. We are here to help those in our communities, and this is our main focus in this space. And so sometimes we offer a percentage or an entire offering in which we give back to those in need in our communities. And we offer here in this space of Tulā community a place and a platform for people to be able to share their work just as much as we share our work. And so in the podcast, we connect with people to give them more of a platform, a place to talk, share, a place for knowledge, a place for their work, what they're doing in the world, and knowledge that we feel is important for others. So connecting with people that we feel are doing good work in the world. At Tulā Community, we offer space on our social media platforms for your photography work, maybe your artwork, things that you would like to share. It's been great to connect with so many people through different mediums. We offer photography work, videography work. We help people in their businesses and in digital creation, and hold space and time for mentorship, questions. Many of these just being offered from our hearts. We want to help and give you a really nice platform and space to be able to succeed and live your dreams and your creations. In this podcast episode, I talk with Zoe. Zoe's the first person I talk to. If we're going in order here, this is the first interview I did. And I met Zoe at One Yoga in Vancouver in the spring of 2022 at a class, and we kept coming to the same class and eventually got connected, and I found that she was just magnificent and a wonderful mind. And she has a lot of things going on similar to how I operate. And so Zoe works in personal training and fitness and body-mind connection. She also is a food justice advocate. She has a lot of great knowledge, which I was totally surprised by in this episode. I was blown away. I was so happy to hear all of these things in food sustainability. And she'll tell you what her knowledge is and what she's finished in school as well. So I'm really happy you're here, and I'm excited to share, and I'm excited to watch this space grow, and I can't wait to talk more and connect more with all of you. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Yeah, we're here to chat. We're here to talk about some good stuff. So maybe it would be nice if you opened with a little bit about yourself and what you're interested in, and what your knowledge is in regards to food and sustainability.
Yeah, for sure. So, hi everyone. My name is Zoe Rhiannon, and I have a business doing strength and movement coaching, and I work in the world of food justice and climate justice and advocate around those issues. So, my background generally is in international environmental politics, actually. And then through that, with a lot of focus on international politics and economics, I got really involved in local food movements and the intersections between local food and international food policy and federal food policy. So I started a nonprofit a few years ago on helping advocate and create more food just systems and create more access to just food in our neighborhoods. And then I also incorporate sustainable living practices and talk a lot about how to have more equitable food access in my business as a strength and movement coach and sustainable leading coach. So yeah, that's my spiel.
It's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
It's very good. It's very good. It's very impressive. I remember when I first connected with you about this, and you kind of taught me a little bit about yourself and whatever, and I was just very impressed. Holy shit, Zoe, like this. Oh, right.
A lot of different stuff. They're
Yeah.
all connected.
Yes.
Once you see the big picture,
Yes.
you gotta wind back a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I know you do have to pull yourself back to be able to understand the full picture of something. You're right.
Yeah.
You know, is there like is there a title that you would call yourself when it comes to like being involved in food sustainability? Is there kind of is there something that you may call yourself? What would you associate that with?
Yeah, so with the nonprofit, which we're actually, probably by the time this podcast is out, will be shut down. We're just taking a step back from that.
Right.
Most of what we were doing was community activism and food asset creation, I would say.
Right.
So it was working to address the local community-based issues of access to nutritious and culturally appropriate food, and then doing education and advocacy around the impacts of food on the climate system and environmental degradation, and how we can have individual and community-based impacts on those issues. So in terms of a title, I'm not really so sure. I was the executive director of that.
Right.
I'm also a certified permaculture designer, so we did a lot of like garden designing and teaching people how to grow food in that scenario.
Right.
But a lot of what we do is advocacy and education around the kind of different threads from these pieces and how they all kind of weave together.
Right.
Because food is a complex issue because it is obviously has federal and provincial support and funding and information and education available to it. We put a lot of individual weight and moral value on the food that we eat.
Right.
So obviously anything around like weight loss or health or nutrition information, there's a lot of money behind that, and also a lot of, cultural significance around how we understand food in that context.
Yes.
And in that case, it's often made to be very individualistic, so that what food do you choose to buy? What food do you choose to eat?
Right.
Without an understanding of where the money is and how some food is just more accessible to us, or different people depending on where you are on the economic spectrum, where you are physically within space, if you're part of a food desert.
Right.
If the food is culturally significant to you, for folks that are maybe from different communities around the world, immigrants, refugees.
Right.
So there's like a lot of different pieces within the issue of like how we get food and how we talk about food.
Right.
And then there's a larger piece of climate justice, which is that our food system is, as I'm sure most people already know to some degree, really bad for the environment.
Right.
So a lot of the work that I try to do is help people understand that the food that we can grow locally, which we have a huge potential to do here in the Lower Mainland,
right, yes,
is generally going to be the food that's also best for the environment, because it's going to be lower greenhouse gas. We can do it using organic practices, using permaculture, and we can actually have that food that then is more financially accessible to the folks that most need it, and using land that's available to us kind of help address a lot of these different issues that are all intersected but also all the same.
Yes, right. It's a lot,
Yeah,
and
it is a big
lot.
Picture,
it's a big issue too, and like, what are some of the ways that it's not environmentally conscious or healthy practices?
Yeah, so when we talk about environmental concerns with any like issue or industry, really, the two main things we consider are climate impact and environmental degradation. And so these are actually not the same thing. And often people treat them like they're equivalents, or like they're, apples to oranges. Right. Or apples to apples, but they're not. They're apples to oranges. And so climate, when we talk about that issue, is really CO2 in, CO2 out, or equivalent, right? So, we talk about like from cows, the whole
methane.
Methane is the one that people are really popular talking about.
Yes, yeah.
That's actually only one small part, though, of the meat industry, is like the farts. Everyone wants to talk about that part of it,
I remember the farts from the vegan days.
Yeah, like that's all people talk about is like cows fart, and that causes climate change. And what you're looking at is
it's kind of a comical way to cause climate change.
Whereas what we're really talking about usually is the grain, the food you have to grow on the land using the pesticides and the herbicides that then are produced using climate intensive products, is then being chopped down, instead of being fed to people, is then going to animals. So then you're really intensifying the amount of energy you need per calorie, whether across micronutrients and macronutrients, So that's where you're kind of really bottlenecking the impact it has on the climate when it comes to meat specifically. So for almost all animal products, there's going to have to be the creation of space for those animals, creation of feed for those animals, and then transportation to and from slaughter sites, and then to and from processing plants, right?
Right.
So transportation is a smaller part of the greenhouse effects from agriculture.
Right.
Most of it actually comes from the production side of it, from like the food that we're producing for these animals,
right.
From the way that we are keeping them in large amounts, the way that we are, just like the scale to which we are doing it all,
yes, right?
Right. And there's the machinery that's used for the farming practices and the type of chemicals we use for that.
Yes, yeah.
The other side of it then is environmental degradation, which is the local pollution of the environment from those practices.
Right.
So things, for example, like you often will hear about, I think in early COVID there was like a lettuce recall because there was sewage from pig farms that was getting out.
Yeah,
and was ruining the lettuce.
Right.
So there are huge swaths, especially in like the southern states, for example, of fresh waterways that you can't eat pretty well because they are. And there's a huge environmental racism question here that we can also bring in that I don't think we have time to get into today, but it's like a huge component of this, especially in the States, but essentially around a lot of these larger factory farms. They just produce so much waste that is so toxic because of the ways the animals are kept together, the amount of antibiotics and medications that they're given to stay alive in those really inhumane scenarios.
Yes, right.
And the food they're fed means that they create basically bio-waste, and then it's put into wasting ponds, so it just sits there.
Okay.
And that just will seep into the environment, or it's put into waterways.
And so is this ways that maybe things like lettuce and whatever could...
so when those things overflow sometimes, that's when you'll have contaminants get into like our food sources, so we can't eat them. Which should tell you that they shouldn't be in the environment to begin with,
no
right?
kidding.
Or they often will seep into the groundwater, which is a huge issue. So especially in the States, and in Canada too, like around Indigenous communities, this is a huge issue. I think in Canada it's less an issue for farms in some cases, where we have a really big issue with pharmaceutical production around Indigenous locations. So they have there's an area called Chemical Valley in Ontario, where essentially all these reserves, the land around them were sold to these really cheap to a bunch of pharmaceuticals. And people were dying in swaths from like really rare diseases from just all the chemicals in the air,
it's going into their water system.
Yeah, going into their water system and into their air. So environmental racism is like a whole other huge topic we get into, but in the States especially, this often happens around communities of color that have historically been in these areas. They're prioritized for this. There's a whole other like layer to it. Yeah,
no kidding.
Which is a huge issue, obviously, for so many reasons. And then we can get into also like environmental racism through the form of redlining, of who has access to good groceries, who has access to good nutritious food from that side.
Right.
And so it's like, it's hard to kind of... There's so many pieces here, right?
Yes,
so
there
we're going
is.
to kind of touch on little bits of it.
Right.
And so that's kind of like the meat side of things. But then we can also get into just the production of the produce, which either is for human consumption or for animal consumption.
Okay.
And then you can get into practices like glyphosate, which is one of the chemicals that's in a lot of, it's in Roundup. Which they've just changed the name of. I can't remember what it is anymore.
Oh, did they change it? So
it's been, there was all the big chemical producing companies have been slowly merging. And they're getting bought out. Right. So like Bayer bought Monsanto a few years ago. Okay. And so they're changing the names of these things slowly.
Yeah, and then people don't know, because a lot of people at this point know the word Monsanto. They know these things. They're familiar,
And so they're creating these larger and larger monopolies to control more and more of the market, right? Which for food sources is dangerous for a number of reasons. Right. Because in the case of... I can't remember the name of it anymore. Right. But we'll keep using Roundup as like the placeholder here. I apologize. I will look it up at the end of this.
Right. We don't at least most people know the Roundup.
I'll send Whitney the name so she can correct this in the notes after.
That's it.
But essentially how that works often is that you have to buy the seeds that have been genetically modified to withstand the Roundup and withstand the glyphosate. And that's how it works, is that you have to buy the seeds in conjunction with the chemicals, so that they don't die from the chemicals. Right. Because they're so intense, they're so toxic to the environment.
So they're having a control of the seed.
So they have a huge monopoly
on the seed.
Not just on the chemicals, but on the seeds as well. And then there's all these legal issues around if people get seeds scattered over the wrong field. Right. There's been stories that people getting sued for accidentally growing these genetically modified, because their patents, they're owned by that company.
Yes, right, at that point,
So that is a whole other like huge political issue in terms of food sovereignty, rights to food. Yes. In cases of larger disease that could come through, or things like pandemics when food systems are more insecure, and our networks are more insecure. Yes. When we use these chemicals that are really harmful to the environment, and when farmers are incentivized and often by policy really pushed to only grow the same few crops over and over again.
Yeah.
It not only is adding these chemicals, they're very harmful to the environment, to the
Yes.
soil, which
Right.
then runs off. It kills off lots of water life in the local waterways.
Right.
Reduces bioavailability. Oh my goodness, what is the word? Biodiversity.
Okay, yeah, good on you. There you go.
Quick
thinking.
In the local environment.
Yes, right. By growing the same crop instead of changing.
But even if it hits other things in the region, it's often just planes over and they drop it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
But also through issues such as it hits your local waterway, it goes to the ocean, and you get huge things like algae blooms because it's. There's going to be so much nutrients of some type or not enough nutrients, and it creates these really big imbalances in the water.
Right.
So that's like a big issue, for example, with nitrogen runoff, because they're killing off all the natural microbiomes in the soil.
Right.
Through these chemicals, they have to add a lot much more nutrients into the soil so that it can feed the plants still.
Right.
So then you're adding in things like nitrogen that the plants really need.
Right.
But you're adding too much, the soil is not healthy enough to hold it, so it runs off, and you get this huge increase of certain nutrients in the water.
Right.
You get algae blooms, and that's when you have like huge amounts of the waters become inhabitable. Inhabitable. It
took me a second there too. I was like, wait a minute. That's all right.
Essentially, it kills off tons of ocean life and sea life, and it becomes this huge and that's not a climate issue though.
Right.
It is, but it isn't.
Right.
That's an environmental degradation issue.
Right.
And so that I think is like, and I can get.
But they're not without each other, you know?
Exactly.
Like
and the ocean.
To have one, it has the other.
When the ocean dies.
Right.
The ocean stores a lot of carbon. So like, as that happens.
Yes. Right.
It can't store as much carbon, and it's going to release a lot of that.
Right.
Like there's a lot of systems here that are interconnected.
Right.
But they are also not the same thing. Because I think often we talk about them, people will say like either it's good for this or it's good for that. But, you know, they interchange them the same way, and so I think it's just important to kind of understand
that there's a difference.
No, it's just more complex than that, right? Like
yes,
it's a bigger picture than just one or the other.
Right. And is like permaculture a good way to avoid or at least like prevent some of this issue with the soil not being able actually to hold the nutrients?
Yeah. So that it's like permaculture is one approach,
right,
which is really just the term that's been bought and sold and marketed, which is repackaging and teaching a lot of indigenous knowledge and things that we already ancestrally know about how to grow food well. So really want to like give note there that like permaculture is like a certificate you can do. It's a way you can like get credibility in the eyes of like institutions and in like to put on things.
Right.
But for the most part, those practices are not new. They are not things that we're just discovering.
Right.
There is an intersection of like new sciences that we're incorporating with it.
Right.
But a lot of it is indigenous practices that folks around the world are still using and have used for hundreds of millions of years. Right. Maybe not millions, but like you know, through time immemorial.
A long time.
Through time immemorial, like these are practices that they've developed and learned by working with the land.
Okay.
And so permaculture is just the term of this kind of like remarketed version of that we can then kind of put a stamp on and say this is permaculture versus, you know, regenerative agriculture, which might be slightly different in theory, in the paper, but really what these practices are all coming back to is how do we use the knowledge that people who have worked with the land in harmony with the land and actually learned from it. How can we reincorporate those to build more sustainable and like resilient food systems? So the soil example for example is soil is like a living entity is the best way to think of it. Right.
Yes.
It's not. I think we often think of dirt. We
think
of,
it's just whatever.
I remember getting into a fight with my ex once because he's like, "Oh, this is dirt," and I was like, "This is soil. This is not dirt."
This
you know?
Exactly.
Dirt gets in your clothes. This is a living, breathing thing.
Right. Yes.
When we talk about soil, it's not just like, I mean, when you ask them what soil is or what dirt is,
right,
they often can't even begin to explain what it is,
right?
Because what it is broken down organic matter.
Yes.
It's the castings of worms.
Right.
It's all the microorganisms that are living in the soil. It's the beetles. It's the worms. It's the mycelium.
Leaves and the
And it's a very complex system. And so how it works in nature essentially is that, you know, nothing goes to waste. Everything is created, gets reintroduced into the system, and so things live. They take what they need, and then they die. Right. And then there are all these systems designed to break them down, take that nutrients that they took from the soil, and bring them back in.
Right. With no human interjection.
It does this naturally, right? And it does this and it brings water into it by creating larger organisms like worms and beetles and things like that, ants that burrow down and create lots of holes so that water
aeration
can really aerate.
That's wonderful.
Easily.
Yes.
and you have, lots of things like roots of different size plants breaking through at different levels to create different networks there and connections.
Right.
And as we're learning more and more, as we do more research into this and into mycelium, there's lots of connections between plants for sharing nutrients and sharing knowledge about the local area.
Right.
And then we have the whole microbiome of soil as well.
Right.
Which is another amazing part of it.
Yes, yeah.
Just like in our guts, we're learning more about the microbiome.
Yeah.
In soil, it's the same thing. It's basically a working stomach, right? So it has this as well that helps keep it all alive and thriving.
Yeah.
And that's just like the very like glossed over version.
The beginning layer. Yeah,
but
the top of the soil.
Yeah, exactly. The most important part of this is that soil is a living entity, and there's lots of different, like hundreds of thousands of different moving pieces, keeping it healthy.
Right.
And a big part of that also is just that it has body to it and has structure.
Yes.
So we could talk about clay, sand, and loam are the components of soil. I'm not going to get into like the triangle and different types right now.
Yeah.
But as we have more organic matter, essentially we'll make more and more healthy and like well-structured soil.
Right.
But part of that also is that the roots hold the soil in place.
Right.
So why I'm explaining all this is that when we get into monocropping and growing like one thing in repetition, is that it's often a system where you might start with really healthy soil. You plant your seeds that require you use these pesticides, because healthy soil will support other types of life.
Right.
So you use these pesticides that only your one crop will grow. When you use these pesticides, it kills off all that other plant matter in the soil that's really important for its health.
Right.
Then what we're doing is taking the crops, so we're taking away the fruit of the plant, which is going to hold a lot of that micronutrients that we just pulled out of the soil.
Right.
And then we're also going to take away a lot of that biomatter, and we're not going to reintroduce it to the soil. We're not going to compost it and just throw it on top.
Right.
It's all getting removed.
Okay.
So the soil's not being left without that root system to hold it in place and keep it supported. It's being left without the same level of biodiversity it had, because a lot of those chemicals are going to go through and kill off a lot of those plants.
Right.
And then you're often going to leave it bare for a while, because you're going to plant your next crop in it.
Yeah.
And cover cropping is not a super common practice.
Right.
So you don't have any root system or anything holding the soil in place.
Right.
And keeping the water in, keeping it all kind of contained.
So usually everybody pulls everything out instead of leaving the root systems in.
And this is when you get things like the Dust Bowl, for example.
Okay.
So the Dust Bowl that happened in the Great Depression was that people kept pulling things out. The top layer of soil dries out completely because the organic matter is dead.
Right.
And it just blows away.
Okay.
Right? So like those are things that we now know are really easy to fix. You plant some crops there, your soil's not going to blow away. It's also not going to run away either.
Yeah,
but it's also a big thing if you have flash floods, your whole layer of topsoil is just going to run down the river.
It's going to go,
And then you have other huge contamination issues, right?
Yes.
And so as the cycle continues, you're going to do more and more damage to your soil until there's no nutrients left really in it. Until you have to start adding more and more pesticides to it to like get the soil to have any nutrients for the plants.
Right.
Because the plants need those nutrients to grow, right? Like they don't just make them themselves; they pull them up from the ground.
Right.
And so that's, I think, like one of the biggest kind of things when we talk about like industrial agriculture. So in terms of kind of moving away from that, there's a bunch of different practices that are trying to explore and look at new ways of growing food that are more like biosupportive of those systems.
Right.
So organic is one system that still has a number of pesticides and herbicides that can be used.
Right.
Also, sorry, I use the word pesticides generally, but pesticides refer specifically to pests. Herbicides are for other plants.
Right. Like a weed or whatever.
Yeah. So generally, like Roundup glyphosate is not going to be doing all that stuff.
Right.
I mean, it's pretty bad for everything. But
right.
It's probably just going to kill everything.
Yes.
But usually these things are getting like concoction of different things.
Right.
Depending on their environment and the built environment.
Right.
But then we talk about like organic agriculture still uses those pesticides and herbicides.
Right.
And we'll still use inputs because all soil, even healthy soil, often will need some support in what you're growing, right?
Yes,
I don't want to make that out to be a really bad thing.
Yeah, right.
It's with the amounts that we're using, though. Is it able to be absorbed by the soil, or is it running off?
Right.
And is it something that is going to be toxic to the things around it or not, right?
Right.
So organic is like a larger umbrella for that, and it's different from country to country. So the policies for organic agriculture in Canada are different from the States, for example.
Yes, right.
And then there's things like regenerative agriculture and permaculture that are trying to work less with just inputs and more with the inherent knowledge that we know about plants and soil to build in systems that are inherently more long-term resilient and will rely on less and less human input over time to build more just systems that are going to bring a lot of those inputs in naturally.
Right.
So in permaculture, for example, a lot of the teachings come from just looking at forests and how they naturally behave.
Right.
So that's one of the places that it's more of an observation now of just like how life exists.
Right.
So looking at how, if we have big trees, they're not only can bring fruit or nuts or whatever they serve us for, or firewood.
Right.
But they're also providing shade. They're also providing structure to the soil. They can dig down really deep and get groundwater in droughts that might not otherwise be there. They're cooling down the environment, right?
Right.
They're providing structure for things to grow up.
Yes.
And then thinking backwards from that. So like what needs to grow into more shading, what needs more moisture, what needs different micronutrients. Different plants will draw up or emit different types of nutrients or support different types of nutrients.
Right.
So you can plant things together in different ways to optimize that.
Right.
Different things will deter or attract different pests.
Right.
So you can plant together different plants that way to attract or deter pests.
Yeah.
And so it's a way of designing garden beds and designing spaces that will require the least input from humans.
Right.
And will allow the most natural systems to simply take place.
So is the view now at the moment, of course, that this system of working with like permaculture and actually bringing in structure to the soil is that, of course, it's not something that you can monopolize on. There's not money to be made. At least the view right now is that there's not really that much money to be made. It's similar to like pharmaceuticals and natural health and whatever.
So the issue of patents becomes a really difficult, complex issue when it comes to seed sovereignty.
Yeah, okay.
And that's when we get to the kind of issue of food sovereignty specifically.
Right.
So, for anyone that doesn't know, food sovereignty is the term that's used generally to describe who has access and the right to food and who controls the means of production of food.
Okay.
So, right now, if you're living in a really urban center and you buy your food from the grocery store, you have very little food sovereignty.
Right.
For the most part.
Right.
And you'll see things like in the pandemic, early days, when we all saw how empty food grocery stores were.
Yes, right.
This presents a really complex issue often, where if you only have one food source locally, if you have one grocery store, then, and like you might not even have that. A lot of folks live in food deserts where they don't even have a reliable grocery store.
The definition of a food desert is what?
Sorry,
No, it's okay.
A food desert, I'm not sure what the official definition is off the top of my head. In terms of like kilometer distance.
Okay.
But a food desert is essentially a region of a city or a township or an area where the folks that live there don't have reliable and safe, easy access to nutritious and culturally appropriate and affordable food.
Okay.
So this is places where, for example, your grocery store is like an hour walk away and there's no good bus to get there.
Okay.
It's places where they only have convenience stores or fast food places.
Right.
It's places that might only have like luxury food items. A lot of gentrification, for example.
Things that are not accessible.
But they can't get food as appropriate.
Right.
Or places that only sell like food for one cultural identity, and so you can't get foods that might how to cook or you know what to do with. Right. So it's like a very complex, and we can get a lot into that. A lot of environmental racism also often comes into this. In terms of poor neighborhoods are more prevalent with people of color. And how that intersects with this.
And the quality of the food that is around in that area. Right.
And so that's like a huge equity issue and huge policy issue that is obviously super important, but I think just beyond the scope of what we're discussing right now. But just something to like be really aware of. All of these issues that we're discussing today really intersect with race, intersect with income, with wealth, with poverty, with gender issues as well sometimes. So like just to be aware that is all there.
There's no isolation.
Even if we're not like getting deep into it, it's all still there. So that's what food sovereignty is, though, is like, do you know where your food comes from? Do you have some control over it, or sort of some autonomy over it? And so, like, just like a sovereign country, for example, or a sovereign state is a state that has control over their own borders and, like, self-sufficient within that realm. That's what it means to be food sovereign as well. It's like, do you have choice and autonomy over who you are and what you do with your food? And choice there. So it cannot get complex in how we define that, though, because you might like have a grocery store in your neighborhood, but does it have food that actually is affordable to you, that is nutritious at the same time, or that you know how to cook? So that's when it can become more complex. And then when we get into things like monocultures and patents on foods, it gets really complex because things like price jacking can happen. Monopolies where they can control the supply and demand, not demand so much, but they have a lot of sway in the world of policy, so they can push demand in certain directions. So that's like a really big issue you see often in North America specifically, is that the foods that are taught to us as being healthy aren't necessarily what is most supported in the literature.
Right.
Or what we see marketing for the most, for example.
Right.
Got milk, like that whole
I
campaign,
know, yeah, right.
That's not a nutrition campaign.
Right.
That was a campaign by milk producers.
Yes, right.
Right? And yet a lot of people think that was a nutrition campaign.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Because it talked about nutrition in it.
Well, it comes up with the calcium.
Yeah.
So much, you get so much conversation in day to day about calcium in milk and that you need it for milk. And it was actually, I have a book right there, Got Milked. And this was talking about, that the calcium in cow's milk is not actually easily absorbed by the human body. And you end up just peeing it out anyway.
But then there's so many things like that, for example, within our nutrition policy.
Yes, right.
Looking at Canada's food guide, for example.
Right.
The last time it was updated, I think it was early 2019 that we had our most recent one come out.
Right.
And that was the first time that milk wasn't touted as the number one drink you should drink.
Yeah,
right.
That
you should drink water instead.
Yeah.
We have
Who would have thought?
we have supply management in Canada from dairy as well.
Okay.
Which is
well, yeah, I'd imagine. I feel like we have a good percentage of our economy is rooted in milk farming and stuff like
dairy,
that. Production,
dairy, poultry, eggs, and pork, I think, are some of the big ones
for
us.
Those are the big Canada ones?
Those are, well, in terms of trade specifically.
Okay.
So what used to be NAFTA and now is the North American trade? No. The America-US Mexico trade agreement.
Oh, is there a new thing?
I'm going to get it wrong. The new NAFTA. Again,
I'll add it in the notes.
Yeah, the acronyms are escaping me right now.
But what used to be NAFTA.
But what used to be NAFTA.
Okay.
Which was a North American Free Trade Agreement.
Yes.
And now I can't remember what it's called.
What the new one? I don't know either, so
I can
I'm sorry.
see it in my mind, but I can't think of how to say it.
It'll come to you.
Head. But that one of the biggest sticking points when they were renegotiating it was supply management for dairy in Canada. Because we have so much support and so much safety nets for it. Yeah. And that's part of why it was in the food guide, is because agriculture policy and nutrition policy in Canada are controlled by two different federal policies. Huh. And so out in Canada, we have agriculture as one department federally, and we also have nutrition as another department, which is through health, and agriculture is through agriculture, essentially. And so within that, there's some overlap that lobbies have. For example, the dairy lobby has had a huge impact on Canada's food guide for many, many years. Mm-hmm. Many lobbies have had an impact on Canada's food guide for many, many years. Mm-hmm. For a while, we saw like the push for low-fat things, which is its whole own issue.
Yeah, the low-fat.
And like what was it? Like the late 90s, early 2000s, that was a big trend.
Yes, it was, yes.
And a lot of this that we're seeing in food trends often aren't based just on the science that's come out, because obviously it's not the best science. Right. But it's based on lobbies by food producers to sell different products. Right. And so in 2019, Canada's food guide had a new food guide came out. It was pretty big deal because it was the first time that dairy wasn't really pushed as the number one thing to drink. It was like water was the new
yes
drink.
Yeah.
And it also was the one that we saw there's less impact from the other industries that are bigger and pushed in Canada as well. So it was the first time that we saw that meat, for example, was seen as a protein source, but shouldn't be your main protein source. It shouldn't be eaten in excess or every day. Oh, excuse me, drank too much tea.
Too much water for Zoe. She's over here telling people drink more water.
Take hydration.
Stay hydration.
Next time I'm on the show, we'll just talk about the importance of hydration.
Yeah, we could do that. I would love to do that.
So you have these places where the lobbies impact the nutrition policy, for example, and the lobby comes in and will help shape nutrition policy, which we're seeing less of now in Canada, which is really exciting. There's a lot of overlap when it comes to our food and agriculture and nutrition in terms of what is told to be healthy to us. Is often has more to do with what markets are profitable and what markets want to make money and who's holding power there, and who has sway over the government, versus just what's best for you in reality.
It was always one of my sayings, and I don't remember if I read it somewhere, but I either adopted it or I came up with it. I have no idea, but I always thought and said that if a food item has a commercial, then you shouldn't be eating it.
That's amazing.
I don't know who coined that, but I read it somewhere once.
I love that.
It's very good,
Yeah, that's so funny.
Right? Nothing has a commercial that's like should be going in your body. Like,
there's some things that do, and there's some products that can be really good, right? Like, I think there's a push often for BC blueberries, right? BC blueberry growers will have ads
Oh, yeah,
that eat more
that's
BC
true.
blueberries.
That's
and
true.
And this isn't always a bad thing, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah,
supporting
right.
local markets
Yes.
isn't inherently
And it's a
wrong.
healthy food.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's
right.
not inherently a bad thing to want to support your local farmers or support your local industries.
Yeah, right.
It's that one that's impacting our nutrition policy.
Right.
And the policy around funding for what food is made more accessible financially, that's when it becomes an issue,
Yes, right.
Because, support your local farmers. Like, that's what we need to be doing more of,
Absolutely.
right? It's just like, it's just, where is that in conjunction with the rest of our nutrition and information around that, right?
Right.
So then when we're looking at in terms of accessibility of food,
Yes.
the food that's most accessible is the food that has the most often federal support.
Right.
So most food production is subsidized in some form.
Right.
It's not a free market.
Right.
I love how folks like to tout that we live in a free market world. We don't.
Right.
Just like oil and gas is not a free market.
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is highly subsidized by the government.
yeah, right.
We're not going to get into that one
Yeah,
today
it's no
either,
different.
but-
Yeah, right.
But that is,
yes.
we are very inefficient in that realm specifically.
Right.
So,
right.
and so there are certain things that are made more accessible through those processes, right? And so the forms of agriculture production that are best for humans and best for the environment are not often the ones that are the most profitable.
Right.
And so they're not the ones that are going to be marketed the same way.
Right.
And then we can get into the nuance, which I don't think we have enough time for necessarily today. There's more important things for us to discuss.
Right.
But in terms of like why a reduction in meat consumption, for some folks going vegan might be the best choice for them. For a lot of folks that might not be.
Just a reduction,
what's best,
Yes.
but reduction in meat generally, because currently so much of the food that humans could be eating and the land used for that in terms of the raw produce to feed the animals that we're then going to kill and then get the food from, in terms of calories, in terms of protein crossover, it's so inefficient for us to actually feed it to an animal and then eat it back versus just to eat those calories ourselves.
Right.
So we talk about land use and we talk about
and less water
and
as
less
well.
Water.
Yeah,
that's a big part that I feel like often isn't actually like addressed in enough like succinctly enough to have that conversation.
Yes,
is that it's not just an issue of like it's complex, but also like we could actually be eating all those calories and then reducing the footprint we need, have a lot more farmland for produce, have a lot more farmland for these things that are currently harder to get.
Well, and better conditions, of course, for the animals in and of itself.
Exactly,
you know,
and that can get into a whole much bigger conversation.
It's a huge conversation.
Right?
Right.
And like, how do we make that more accessible? How do we make that easier for folks?
Right.
How do we make that more like financially accessible for people to grow also? Because it can be really hard for farmers currently to transition to using different types of pesticides or herbicides.
Right.
Getting an organic designation if they want to do that can be really expensive.
Right.
Having the market for them to sell to can be very expensive because often like organic farms only sell at a premium.
Right.
And currently models like regenerative agriculture and permaculture, the way that we do them on a small scale, are not going to produce enough food.
Right.
In the way that they're currently used
right.
to produce like the masses of people that we have.
Right.
So then we have to ask questions in terms of how can we take those principles and translate them in ways that we can apply on a large scale, right?
Right.
And there's many ways to do that in terms of crop rotation,
yes.
in terms of letting things go fallow and having cover crops.
Right.
And so there's lots of ways. That's more of a regenerative agriculture than permaculture.
Right.
Permaculture is much more small scale usually, than regenerative
yes.
get much more larger scale.
Right.
And there's lots of ways people are incorporating this more indigenous, more traditional knowledge of growing food into things to kind of bring that in.
Yes.
And make it more sustainable long term
right.
for the masses, because we are not just talking about ourselves and our neighbors. We're talking about, when it comes to the large food system, how are we feeding everyone on Earth?
Yes.
And that
right.
can get into a much bigger, larger global food system, which I think we're not going to get into either today.
Right.
Equity on that level is a huge issue as well.
Of course, right.
But how that comes back into like local access to food and local food sovereignty. Kim, if we defined food sovereignty already or not, if we got cut out.
I actually don't know. I was thinking about that, but I'm not sure, you know.
But food sovereignty, when we use the word sovereignty, when we talk about a country, for example, a sovereign country or a sovereign state is a country that has control of their own borders and it has autonomy within how they run themselves.
Right.
And so that's the same way we think about food. So if you're sovereign in food, you have control and choice over your food. You have access to food that gives you real choice. And so that's again that same questions we often asked. Is it affordable? Is it nutritionally appropriate?
Yes.
And is it culturally appropriate?
Culturally appropriate.
And physically accessible. Like, can you get to it?
Right. And do you know how to cook it? You know, like.
And do you have the tools you need to prepare it?
Yes. Right.
And so that's when we get into like often the big equity issue and an equity question around who has the best access to food, how that's distributed,
Right.
how we prioritize the food that's most accessible.
Right.
Because the food that's worst for us is often the one that's the cheapest, right?
Yeah,
Which actually
always.
it seems counterintuitive because it's the most processed, so you think it's going to
Yeah.
have the most input, so it's going to cost more, right?
See, I never kind of understood that. I never understood how, like, you know, there's more like labor that goes into the processed food, but it's so cheap. I never really understood that.
It's because they're able to cut costs earlier on through this like mass monocropping and this mass culturing of things.
Right.
Versus if you're going to be growing like produce, it needs much more like attentive attention one-on-one than like just potatoes, for example. You can grow like huge swaths of potatoes, throw tons of nitrogen on them. You're gonna totally destroy your local waterways, but you still do it, right?
But you can get this.
Yeah. Whereas like lettuce is a lot harder to do that with necessarily. Right. It needs each individual head to be much more delicate with.
Yeah.
Not fully, because in industrial agriculture we can do a lot with machines nowadays. But it is just like a slightly different process.
Right.
Or like corn, for example. A big one, high fructose corn syrup.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
Huge excess of corn in the States. Many years ago now, which led to the creation of high fructose corn syrup.
Right.
They just got put in everything because there's too much of it, and there's a huge lobby and a huge market.
Is that what happened?
Yeah,
was
literally
too much of it.
Literally, it's too much corn, so they're like, what can we do with all of it?
Huh. Okay.
So a lot of these things, they come from the supply and demand of the food market. They come from who already holds power and holds the money, and that's kind of what leads our food in different directions.
Right.
So when we talk about community and like what we can do as community, we often want to think about not just for ourselves, like what can I access, but how are my neighbors accessing this? How are people that live in different cities or different neighborhoods accessing this? And how is the whole food system supporting the most people possible?
Right.
I think often our first approach is, and I'm a big advocate of like locally growing food, growing food in community. And we'll talk about that more. But, but also like how are we supporting advocacy and policies that not just feed us, our families, and our community, but also globally, federally, provincially. Like how are we taking care of everyone else and the planet around us, right? Because we can't all just have hobby farms. Like,
it's
we
true.
Can't just all move to the country. There's not the land for that, right?
Right.
Density is one of the best
not
things.
A lot of people live in an area where they can have any sort of garden. You know, that's just not the way. Urban centers and things like that. And
density is actually in many ways a way more ecologically friendly way of doing things.
Right.
So how can we then have community gardens, but also then have the efficiency and the productivity in our more rural areas to grow the food for those areas. So it's definitely a bunch of give and take between those realms.
Yeah, no kidding. And then in like a personal kind of individual level, like food sovereignty and independence, like what are things that people can do in the Lower Mainland that could be helpful for them, and also just general tips for anybody wanting to have some sort of a garden and ways that they can, produce for themselves. What's a knowledgeable way to approach that?
For sure. So I think that there's a few different kind of ways to start with this. I'm going to kind of first talk to folks that have access to land in some capacity.
Right.
And then we're going to talk to folks that don't have access to land.
Right.
And then we're going to talk to folks that don't have financial access to food. Because those are kind of the three different stages, I think, that are important here.
Right.
So if you have access to land that you can work and grow food on, congratulations. Amazing.
Yeah. Lovely.
So exciting.
Yeah, we love it.
Growing food is one of the best, most magical processes you can do, you know? It's like it's the super cool thing.
It's very rewarding.
It looks like a little, like a rock in the ground, and then you have tomatoes next.
Yeah, what the hell?
So I would say often when it comes to growing your own food, I'm not going to go into the nuances of how to do that right now.
That's a big, distance, spacing.
But I'd say the biggest things are just take the time you need to actually assess your environment, your resources, and the time and energy you're willing to put in.
Right.
And actually use that to make real educated choices about what you choose to grow.
Right.
Because I think often when I talk to folks, the number one reasons that their gardens aren't succeeding is not because they have a bad location or bad soil. This is the wrong location for what they're trying to grow.
Yeah, right.
So if you have a really shady, or like partially shady yard, you might not have the best luck with tomatoes.
Right.
And that's okay.
Yes.
You can grow lots of kale. You can grow other things.
Right.
You can grow lots of
Lettuce
herbs.
is very good here. Right.
So really take your time and don't just rush into it.
Right.
Take a day or two, do some research.
Right.
Really watch the area you're going to plan on growing on.
Right.
And ask like, okay, how much sun does it realistically get?
Yes.
How much energy can I personally put in? Because some plants will take a lot more.
Yes.
And just take some time, watch some YouTube videos. There's some great resources out there if you just do some Googling.
Right.
Instagram accounts.
Right. That was something I discovered here last year. I grew things that I definitely shouldn't have been growing. I was like, my spot's relatively shady for the most part. It doesn't get full sun. So then I had to reroute my stuff this year. I was like, okay,
yeah. And there's tons of resources too. So
Right.
places like West Coast Seed, for example, is a
wonderful
seed company.
place. Yes.
And at almost any gardening store, they'll have the seed planting chart you can get for
Right.
free.
Right.
That will have the planting schedule in terms of what you can plant when.
Right.
And based on what temperatures and what kind of markers in the
Right.
seasons to follow.
Right.
They're also a great website for like our local area because they are kind
Right.
of from BC.
Right.
And they have lots of information on every plant you can imagine. You
Right.
can go on their website, search it up, and it'll tell you when to plant it, what kind of light it needs, what kind of soil it needs.
Right.
And you can get more or less nuanced with how much detail you want to go
Right.
into that.
Right.
But I'd say really just take the time
Right.
with your energy as well. Think about how much energy you can give to it.
Right.
Because
Yes.
some plants you can kind of leave and they'll do their thing.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
are much
True.
more high maintenance,
They need
right?
they need the attention.
And just like, take some time, do some of your own personalized research. I'd also say if you have land, ask yourself if you can actually utilize that land and if you have the physical and interest to do that yourself.
Right.
And if you don't, ask who in your community might want to use that land, right?
Right. Yes.
It's a definitely huge privilege in this area
Yeah.
to
To
have
have
access
space.
to land.
Yeah. Right.
And so if you can't use it, connecting with local community groups, connecting with local just neighbors in
Right.
general.
Right.
Local people who are involved in the food system, so community gardens, for example, if it's one in your neighborhood,
Right.
going and talking to them about people who might be on the wait list and then talking about how they can use that space
Right.
is a great way that even if you personally aren't interested in growing food or can't do it yourself,
Right.
to help create more food sovereignty in the community in general.
Right.
Because the more food we can create within our community, the more resilience we can develop here.
Yes.
And the more support we can have for folks that need it, right?
Right. Right.
So then from that, for folks that don't have their own access to
Yeah.
land,
Right.
which especially for a lot of young people right now is the
Yeah.
reality.
Yeah, of course.
Because either apartments or you live in a rented house
Yes.
where you can't
Right.
dig up
You
the
can't
yard.
use. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Or
Right.
the volatility of community gardens. If we're in Vancouver proper, a lot of the community gardens have a 5-year plus wait list.
Oh, is that right?
So, yeah,
I didn't know that.
You're moving around
Holy
or you
shit.
get rent evicted.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
might be on a wait list for one and it might take years to get there, right?
No way.
So that's places where
That says so much.
Yeah, so there are different kind of organizations popping up trying to address this in different ways.
Right. Right.
Either through growing food, talk to your local community garden because they'll often have an idea of who's in the area
Right.
doing work.
Right.
My organization that we're now shutting down was doing a lot of community garden in front and backyards.
Okay.
We're kind of closing down, but I know there are other like very localized community groups doing that.
Right.
So that's another place that's great to get connected to your local food network.
Right.
Just search in food justice, food advocacy,
Right.
food network in your
In
city
your
name.
area, yeah.
And you'll
right.
often find something coming up, and there's a lot more going on than you might suspect.
Yeah.
And that's a great way to either find lands that you can use.
Okay.
Young Agrarians has a part of their website for young folks specifically
Right.
about land sharing just for yards on their website.
Right.
Last I checked, there wasn't much on it in the Lower Mainland, but that might have changed.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
But there's also other places you can get involved in the food system with in terms of food donations, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So community fridges in Vancouver proper are getting much more popular right now.
Okay. Yeah. I don't really know too much about that.
Yeah, so these are fridges that are maintained by volunteers.
That's sweet.
They're often always looking for volunteers if you're interested.
Right,
So
right.
one of these is called Vancouver Community Fridges. The other one is called the LOAF Community Fridge Project.
Right.
And so you can find them on Instagram, you can Google them, and they essentially have volunteers that just help maintain these fridges. They're plugged in outside of businesses or outside of homes that supply the electricity.
Right.
And it's a give what you can, take what you need system.
Yeah.
So if you grow more food than you need, for example, and you can bring it to this fridge, amazing.
Right.
If you are at your grocery store and something's on a really great deal and you buy more than you need, you can drop it off at the fridge.
Right.
And this is a great way to support our community food systems in a way that is as equitable and accessible as possible.
Right.
Things like food banks often have really long lines. They have certain hours
Yeah.
to look at, and so
Well, and I find too, it's the only one that people know about. Like, it's
Yeah.
the most present, most popular, it's the most well known. It's in the name. You
Yeah,
know, it's like
exactly.
the food bank. That's it. You know, so
but I think a lot of folks who might be food insecure
Yes.
might not think that they're starving, so they don't deserve the right to that.
Okay.
Or they might be more willing to use something with a little
like
more
a
bar
community.
access, like a
Yeah,
community
that makes
fridge.
sense.
So a lot
right.
of folks are food insecure that might not want to consider themselves food insecure,
Right.
because there's a lot of shame and a lot of stigma around that, right?
Right.
So if you're in a
Right.
position where you're able to, contributing time or money or food to those systems can be really great.
Right.
Other systems like Food Stash Foundation.
Right.
Is a really
That's a hard
amazing-
one to say. That there's two S's in a row.
Food Stash Foundation.
Yeah. Okay.
It's an FSF. They
So he said systems.
they do a lot of really amazing work though.
Right.
And we've had the pleasure of working with some of their volunteers in the past, and they essentially collect and get donations of produce and food from grocery stores that won't be sold or can't be sold.
Because it's like unattractive or whatever's got a little dent in it.
Or like there's some little problem with it. And they make huge food boxes and they bring them around to families who are like new Canadians, single moms, low income families,
beautiful,
refugees.
Right.
And so they have that one component. They also have a pay what you can food market available.
Love it.
And they're always looking for volunteers.
Right.
And they also have a free fridge outside their location, and they have their pay what you can food market.
Right.
And a lot of community centers will have access to this information too. So so that's a place that if you're looking to volunteer, to give time, or to get involved with, is really great to kind of get plugged into.
Right.
And if you're in a different municipality, I'm sorry I have less information.
Right.
But you can get in contact with probably a local community center, local community organizations, and they should have an idea of what's going on locally.
Right.
And then if you're in a position where you're not able to access food, that is also a great time that if you're able to, and I know this can be a huge ask in terms of time and energy.
Right.
But look into if there's community fridges in your neighborhood.
Okay.
Check out those local systems.
Right.
See if there's community gardens that have empty plots available or have a system for folks that need access to food.
Right.
Because sometimes they'll often have extra food. They might have a pantry or a place that people can donate it to that way.
Right.
Talking to neighbors in terms of growing space. But even like growing food is a huge privilege. Having the time and the energy and the money to put into a garden is a huge privilege.
Yes,
right?
it is a privilege. Yes.
But yeah, there are some places around. There are some systems that can help support that.
Right.
Again, Food Stash, if you're in need of those food deliveries and that applies to you, might be a great option to kind of get in contact with.
Right.
But then it's a big piece of getting involved with community members, kind of self organizing. And creating these food systems. So the community fridges are one that might be a lower bar of entry if some folks are interested with their friends to organize a fridge. There's a lot of businesses that are often willing to sponsor them outside their business.
Right.
As long as you have the volunteer base to help maintain them.
Right.
And that can be a really great way to see a come and go of direct food aid to your community.
Yeah, right. And get familiar with that and that it exists and how it kind of works and stuff, right? Yeah. I find too with the garden, like, overall, if you do have the ability to have a garden or use a community garden, whatever, that like you do just have to do it. You have to just try. You have to experiment. You have to see. Use your knowledge. Like learn about what the conditions might, for a favorable harvest and what have you. But like you do just need to. You have to just experiment. I don't really feel that there's much other way about having a garden than just winging it, figuring it out on your own, seeing what works in your space, And
that's the thing, is like it's a real give and take.
It is.
No matter how many YouTube videos you watch or how many books you read.
It might not work,
At the end of the day, you have to listen to the earth and listen to the plants that are growing there and the soil that you're working with and see what's actually growing and really observe it and be still and take your ego out of it.
Yeah.
And kind of actually let the plants tell you what they need.
Well,
they'll often tell you more than you expect.
Oh, absolutely. And it's such a beautiful way to like remove your ego because you're working like just with earth, and something that is like, even though you're trying to like, meddle in it, it's just like, no, the plant will tell you. And I find there's good resources nowadays that you could Google anything like that the leaves are looking this color, that color, and it tells you, it's very informative to figure out what you've been doing. I do a lot of overwatering. I've done that in the past. So the leaves go yellow. Right.
Or even just things, oh my god, I had an idea, it was right in my brain.
Oh yeah. It was there and now it's gone.
There.
Right. It might come back. I was talking about
in terms of things dying.
Right.
If your plants die, like, yes, that's upsetting. You put time and energy into it.
Yes.
You're gonna compost it back in the soil.
Yes, you are.
Feed all those plants and
animals. Right. There's a positive and
then you're just gonna try again.
You're gonna learn.
And and like that's the great thing about plants too, I think, is that we want them to succeed the first time. We want to see like this, like we have a very linear idea of success. We have a very linear idea of like
true. Yes.
How a good garden's supposed to look.
And our expectations.
And we see death as a really bad thing, especially in the West. Right?
Yeah, that's so true.
We have such a moral connotation with it. Whereas your garden doesn't see death as a morally bad thing. Because when something dies, it feeds everything around it, right? So I think changing that mindset also can be really helpful for gardeners, is that if something's really not working, compost it. Get your compost.
Try again, figure it out.
And then you got that gold to bring back into your garden.
That's true. That's true. That is a wonderful thing. It's a beautiful thing. All right, my friend. Very good. Look at us. Thank you for the tips and knowledge. And I think it would be good if we link all of the wonderful things you talked about for people to check out. There'll be a lot of good stuff.
For me, and I'll try to compile different resources.
Right. Yeah, the Lower Mainland peeps. They're gonna have places to volunteer and things to do. you know. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to share? Any little tidbit of wisdom or knowledge or something that you feel that needs to be said in regards to this?
I guess my only other comment would be, if you're having a hard time in terms of like nutrition and personal eating side of food, in terms of like not knowing where to start or feeling overwhelmed, just kind of take a level of like that autonomy off of yourself almost, and remind yourself that these systems are really complex. There's huge powers working to make it hard for you.
Yes.
And that it's not designed to be easy, and it's not designed to be accessible or something that can come naturally. So I think understanding that can help a lot in terms of the confusion and the misinformation that's out there.
Right.
And also there are choices you can make that are generally better, and it's once you kind of get the hang of it, it's not the rocket science it seems like.
Yeah, true.
And like the general rule that I like to follow is what's best for you is probably what's best for the planet.
Right. Oh, that's nice.
And vice versa, what's best for the planet is probably what's best for you.
Right.
In terms of, you know, if you're making choices for yourself and for your own health, it's probably also gonna in some way impact the planet and allow you to do better work in the long run for what we need for the planet, right? And vice versa for that. So I guess good luck growing food. Let's talk about food. If anyone has any questions about food and that relationship to the policy side of things or beyond that, I do have a master's in this specifically, so that's some background information.
Right.
But you can find me on Instagram at Zowie Rhiannon. That's ZOWIIRHIANNON. And my email or my website is Zoe Rhiannon, just ZOERHIANNON.com. And you can contact me there, get for more information. That's more in like my strength and movement coaching business, but I also often coaching on sustainable living and incorporating these things into our lifestyle. So.
Yeah, right, and the interconnectedness.
Yeah, all the intersections of everything.
Yeah, we
the
love
threads
it.
all come together.
Yeah, right. That was one of the things we bonded on right away, was the fact that we liked so many things and we thought that they all go together and they're gonna have to, and we just want to make it work.
Well, you can't just pick one thing and nothing is isolated, you know.
Yeah,
just like our
that's
garden,
how I feel.
Nothing can be in isolation. So.
It's like the body. It's everything, you know. Like it. Yeah, you're right. You're on the ball. You got it all figured out, my girl.
But the food one especially is a complex one, because it's the self, but it's also the whole world. So
well, you know, I imagine it's going to take a few more episodes to really get to the nitty-gritty.
We can talk about so many things.
Yes, we could talk about so many things. Yeah, right. Thank you so much for being